Hello, everyone. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of speaking to Victor Close and Sarah Wilhelm. I think everyone has met both Victor and Sarah in previous meetings last semester in the Foundations in Planning Practice class, but maybe I'll just invite the two of them to reintroduce themselves.
Perfect. I'm Victor Cluza. I'm a planner with the Huron County Planning and Development Department. I do all of the planning in the town of Goderich and then work on projects kind of countywide.
And I'm Sarah Wilhelm. I'm the manager of policy planning with the County of Wellington. I do countywide planning projects, policy projects, and formerly I've been a development planner for various municipalities.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for being with us under what are kind of challenging times these days. Who would have thought a week ago, right, that we would be dealing with this kind of reality, and the future as it is and the current situation leaves all kinds of questions in all of our minds. But maybe with that bit of background, and we're going to try to momentarily shift into the positive and talk about planning and planning reports and so on, but maybe just provide, I think everyone would be interested to know how your offices are coping currently, both in terms of how you're functioning and how you're dealing with public meetings and the community and so on. So perhaps just to direct traffic a little bit. In this instance, I'll go to Sarah to start with, and then to you, Victor. Sarah?
Okay, so the county offices are closed to the public, aside from essential services, of course. So the planning department is not an essential service, despite what we might all think. I'm in the office right now. I'm the only person here. We were scheduled to have a council meeting tomorrow, which had been scheduled for a week later, but that was canceled today. So we were hoping to get some land division matters and some official plan amendments dealt with, but that's no longer the case. Otherwise, basically all non-essential staff have been sent home to work from home or be redeployed elsewhere as needed. I know one of our municipalities is still hoping to host a public meeting this week, Puss Lynch. They have a few matters that they feel they are critical that they want to deal with. So they're trying to arrange something via Skype, and they've asked one of our planners to be available. We're not, well, I guess the question is whether that meets the Planning Act. That isn't, we're approaching things here at the county, but we are also their consulting planner. So if they want us to be available there, we will do so.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That certainly, you know, as planners, we would do what we can, but recognizing it's a legal framework that we exist within and that we operate within. And at what point does one run the risk of going down a path where, in fact, what you end up doing is inconsistent with the act, which then runs the risk of a decision being not viable or legitimate. Yeah. Victor, so what are you doing in Huron?
Yeah, so I've been sent to work from home. So I am still working away on planning files. The town of Goderich has canceled public meetings and public hearings on an ongoing basis. And so as far as development load, I'm helping out some of the other planners who are still, their municipalities are still hosting public meetings and public hearings for files. But files in the town itself are basically on hold. We're trying to take this as a bit of an opportunity to pivot our workload and sink our teeth into some of those long-term policy projects that can end up being, you know, put on the back burner when the development load is busy. So hopefully it's a bit of an opportunity that way. And luckily the county planners, we also act as the consulting planners essentially for the municipalities within Huron County. And so we're used to working out of the office one day a week normally. So we did have some of the tools in place to be able to work remotely, but there's always teething pains when we get into this and realize that might be several weeks of not being able to go sync your files.
Yeah. I mean, going through my mind as part of this is, what does this mean for students who might be hoping for summer employment? And it's probably premature to try to guess what that will be, because at this stage, we don't know whether offices are going to be closed for weeks or months, and what it would look like at the end of that. And that relates to all of us too, not just the students and their employment opportunities.
I think that we'll see a dip in development files for sure. I'm not sure what that might mean for our staffing levels. As a policy manager, I also see the benefits of being able to, bring that to the forefront. And we have, years worth of work on policy matters that we can take care of. I've also heard that there might be legislation being put through by the province to deal with some of these matters. So I'm sure we'll hear. I know through the American Planning Association that several states have already passed legislation to deal with public meetings through virtual means.
That's interesting. So the notion would be in that context, at least in those states that have done it, that you could hold a meeting, and just as we're having this discussion with 3 of us today, it could be 20 or 30 people online as well as part of a Zoom meeting, which is interesting because, of course, we hope to be through this sooner than later, and there's a building season coming up and so on. And if you can do some work to make sure that we're not dealing with public meetings next September, October that would have otherwise happened in the spring, maybe it can help in that regard. So, well, thank you for those initial comments. So just for the students and by way of background, we have 4 questions, and we'll go through them in kind of a discussion format like we are now. And the notion is to get some sense of the role of written reports within your offices and your experiences and how we lead to quality output and quality composition of that. So the first question I have is, can you identify the range of the types of reports that tend to be written within your department? So maybe in this instance, Victor, I'll ask you to go first.
Perfect. So we do have a fairly broad range of reports that we'll write. Basically, any information we're providing to either local or county council, they'll want a written report as material for that to go on the agenda. The kind of bread and butter, I guess, in my day-to-day work would be planning recommendations regarding Planning Act applications. So that's everything from subdivisions and condominiums to minor variances. But there's also reports when new legislation comes out, if citizens raise a concern about some burning issue, it might be as simple as backyard chickens that the planner gets asked to weigh in on, or new issues that are coming to the forefront for land use planning. So that might be things like Airbnbs. We also will write reports about policy changes. So that's when we get into our 5-year reviews of our planning documents or doing other updates to those policies. Or we'll provide reports regarding options for municipal programs, especially CIPs and those sorts of funding programs that they might have.
You mentioned several examples there, including backyard chickens and Airbnbs, and another one that caught my attention at the last. Do you have a favorite one? A favorite topic that you've had to write on?
My favorite one would be, I guess, Airbnb is an interesting one because I haven't been able to sink my teeth into it fully yet. I've done some background research, but it's one where the report has been percolating for a long time and it hasn't gotten to council yet.
So that's all around whether Airbnb is a good thing or whether there should be regulations connected to it, I'm assuming. So
yeah, how to regulate it, whether to regulate it, what all of the implications are. I almost jumped into the second question there.
Well, we'll hold back on that one then for just a second. That's great. Thank you for that. Sarah, what would your thoughts be on that?
Oh, I think obviously there's a lot of overlap there. I think, Victor, you've covered off the main points. Additionally, I just had annual reporting that we might have for our Green Legacy program, rural water quality. We're now doing monthly updates on our climate change work, source water protection, and then of course we're doing our official plan review, so our municipal comprehensive review under the growth plan. So those are some additional things. We have a separate county land division committee from planning committee, so we write reports there. Those are still planning act reports, local committees of adjustment, and then all the other suite of reports that Victor mentioned. Yeah, I guess the other thing that we do is we write reports to our planning director. because the planning director has approval authority for subdivisions and condominiums and some other applications. So that's another one that, you know, it still needs to go through the correct process to have it documented in the file.
Knowing that in both instances you write for upper tier and lower tier, but Sarah, anything that you notice being different writing for the local municipalities versus the county?
The county, I guess the difference, if we have one municipality that has their own planning department, so when I write comments on their applications, I would be, the lens that I would use is county policies and provincial policies. They'll be capturing all of the local matters. So that's one big difference.
That is an interesting one, isn't it? When you take on that responsibility, essentially with the authority delegated to you from the province to review those local documents, really sitting in the minister's role in some ways, correct?
Yep, that's right.
So the second question is how would a typical planning report be pulled together? So Sarah, do you want to go first this time?
Me? Okay, sure. So I'm thinking more with my development planning hat on, and there's a typical standard format that we would follow, and I can go through that. But some of the other things that might be something that might not pop into someone's mind right away would be, for me, a good report starts with a site visit. It's really important to go out and familiarize yourself with the property and the surrounding area. I can't emphasize that enough. And it's a very lengthy process. You become an expert on the file and on the proposal. So it's a detailed review of all the technical reports in the file. Even though you might not have expertise, you still have to understand what the recommendations might be from a noise report or another technical report. Full review of all of the applicable policies. The other thing that might not be as obvious is considering other decisions on similar files, and making sure that you're being consistent with an approach, because that could have a countywide implication. So we do discuss our files with each other a lot, in informal ways. We have a lot of chats, and I say that planning is a team sport because it is in so many ways, but including within our own office. So it takes days of thorough work to complete a planning report, depending on the complexity. We have, you know, I don't know if it's of value to go through what the typical format would be, but you know, we need to lay out the policy framework, that context, agency review, public input, of course, and the proposal, so the draft amending bylaw, the draft official plan amendment, and then importantly at the end we would have an opinion of policy compliance or conformity, as the case may be, and then our opinion as to whether or not it's in the public interest. So that's my quick.
That's great. There's several points there that I really liked, and maybe I'll hear from Victor and then we'll come back to them. But the three I wrote down is the notion of the site visit, because it's easy to overlook that as a
it is when you're in a rush.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And how important is that actually be done? The notion of looking at other decisions, I thought, was also a really good point to think about. What is I know that planning is not based on precedent, but it is based in consistency and predictability, and it's important to look at it from that point of view. And of course, concluding reports with a professional opinion, which I think is really important. So why don't we hear from Victor, and then maybe we can come back and touch base in those 3 points. Victor?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll go back to the idea of writing a issue-based report. With that, I find if I'm writing a report to the town of Goderich, let's say on Airbnbs, a lot of my work ends up being meeting one-on-one with all of the local staff, trying to pull out their opinions. And unfortunately, if we can't have a meeting where everyone's at the table, sometimes I'm put in the role of cross-pollinating all their different opinions and trying to make sure that we get staff on the same page. And it's similar to when you're reviewing technical reports. I'm not an expert in the area of most town staff, but ultimately I'm writing the report to council that's summarizing their opinions. So it's tricky to try to do that in a concise way and being accurate.
Hmm.
And I've definitely stubbed my toe early in my career on that sometimes. Definitely, I'm always going to be going back to the legislation and the policy and trying to read it specifically with a case in mind. Sometimes I might be tempted to run off of my memory of what the Planning Act says or what the PPS says, but sometimes a small difference in wording between how I think the policy works versus what it actually literally says has ended up changing my opinion on how something has to be managed. And then the other thing that I thought I'd mention, it's almost like reviewing other decisions that have been done, but it's the rob, steal, and duplicate step. So looking at how other jurisdictions have dealt with a problem, whether they've dealt with a problem, looking at their policies and approaches and seeing what might work for the town of Goderich or for Huron County, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Good points. I know that in class we've developed draft official plan amendments and draft zoning bylaws, and it's, you know, the format, the layout's not so different, and there's lots of overlap also in terms of reports, isn't there? But again, there's a couple of things you mentioned I really liked as well, was engaging the local staff, the notion of stubbing your toe and then hopefully learning from that exercise, and double checking data and how important that is as well, because you're right, I have a memory, or you have a memory of the provincial policy statement says X, Y, or Z, but we forget that it was reviewed just recently and maybe it's not quite the same, or our memory is a little bit flawed as well. So there's several points that you both mentioned. Do you want to comment on either of the points? Sarah, anything that I reflected on from yours, or anything related to what Victor was saying?
Well, I think when you're writing a report has a life of its own, and it can come back to haunt you. So it can be scary when you start out, because there's a lot of weight that comes with that. I think that you need to really be careful and cautious and learn from your peers, and try not to be too flippant about things. The site visit, I worked for the city of Phoenix many years ago, and we did site plans, and we weren't allowed to go on site because we had such a high volume. So they had a protocol for how photos would be submitted and where they had to be, what angles they were taken from. And I would still sneak in site visits from time to time, but it's something that I insist on now. I don't go to a public meeting unless I've been out to the site. And if I have an LPAT matter, or formerly an OMB matter, I would visit the site on my way to the hearing always, because any surprises before I head right in. So, and even when I've done it for pre-consultations, it's surprising how a site visit can be a bit of a fact checker. It keeps people maybe a little more honest sometimes, how they might represent the condition of the site even.
Yeah. As you say that, I can remember being in the office in Huron years ago, and whenever someone would come in, the first thing I would do is always go grab an air photo. And the reason why I would grab the air photo is that the reality of what the air photo tells me is often different than people's own perception of it, which I think is
true.
You study geography and has a good sense of space and distance. Was always amazing that people would think, oh, it's just like it's right there, or it's forever away, and yet it's and I think people were honestly saying those things. It was just their perception of it, which was always interesting. Victor, any comments you want to make in any of the points that have been made to this point?
I guess I'll just jump on the site visit bandwagon. I didn't actually have that in my notes that I pulled together, and I was a little embarrassed when it came up. So how did I miss that? But yeah, I think site visit and early in the process, sometimes I'd get busy and end up doing my site visit very, very close to the report deadline for a matter. And I've burned myself sometimes where I'm working really late to try and account for an issue that I didn't anticipate until I saw the property and realized, oh, there's a air conditioning handler right on the side of the building there, and I never would have thought about that based on the air photo or the application package.
Yeah, good point. And And Google Earth or Google Maps doesn't quite do it either, does it? I remember, you'll appreciate this, Victor, years ago when Gary Davidson was the director of planning in Huron, and I worked for Gary for many years. He had a little sign in the back hallway that said, if you're in the office, you're not doing your job, which has always stuck with me yes, you do need to be in the office once in a while, but how important it is to be out there doing those site visits and doing those evaluations and what you learn from that and talking to people as part of that too.
Yeah.
Great comments. Thanks for those. Let's move to the third question then. And this is really looking at effectiveness. So what tends to distinguish an effective report from a less effective report? And it no doubt will reflect some of what's already been said. And I put in brackets there best practice. But this notion of, because you want to be effective with council, you want to effectively convey your message back to the public, you want to get your opinion out there clearly. What are some of the things that we can do to make for effective reports? So Victor, why don't you start this one?
Sure. I think, again, these are kind of things that I learned by doing them wrong the first couple of times, but I found I have to really, really work at keeping things as clear and concise as possible. If I want members of the public or council to fully read the whole report, I don't have a lot of spare space for wasted words. I've also flipped, when I started out, I'd go through and I had a very, I guess, almost academic approach to it, where I said the test is it consistent with the PPS? Does it conform to the county official plan? Does it conform to the local official plan? So those would be the sections of my report. And it got very, very repetitive. And because the issues are kind of the same, it's just the granularity of the policies as you get down. So I ended up flipping over to topic or issue-based reports. So rather than dealing with density 3 different times, I deal with density once and I say the PPS says this, county official plan says this, town of Goderich says this is how this relates to this proposal. And then the other thing, I haven't learned this the hard way yet and hope not to, but I think it's just important, as much as it's good to be clear and concise, there are those files where it goes to an appeal or someone looks at it. And so you need to have enough there to defend your opinion and to really justify why you're saying what you're saying, because you don't want a developer to come in 10 years later and throw an old report in your face and say, well, what's different about this? It's really nice if 10 years ago you wrote into the report, this is specifically why this is important in this case or is not important in this case.
Those are great points. In particular, the notion of just thinking about your report, how does it look 10 years from now is probably sobering for all of us. So it's a good point. Let's go to Sarah, and then we can bounce back and forth with some reflections. Sarah?
Okay. Ditto. It's important to consider your audiences. You've got more than just council that's going to be trying to absorb the information that you have. It is dry, as interesting as it might seem to us. It's difficult for some people to get. Sometimes I'll test things on my husband because he's not a planner, and one time when I used the word berm, he didn't know what I was referring to, and that was a bit sobering for me. I thought everybody knew what that was. I try to use bulleted lists and tables where I can. And if you look at a council agenda package, they're hundreds and sometimes they're 1,000 pages long. So the reality is you do need to help your council be able to absorb what you've written. So I try to do that as much as I can, but now that we're getting into accessibility standards, I'm not sure I'll be able to continue. Tables are very hard for readers, so or for the audio readers, for people that aren't sighted. So I might have to rethink my approach. But the other thing, be mindful of your use of acronyms and planning jargon. It's still necessary. I'm not suggesting that you dumb things down by any means, but there is a place for plain language and for some of the planning jargon. My suggestion is to use appendices when you can. I do monitor reports at other municipalities for various reasons because we compare notes. I've seen some that are really, really long, or I guess if I look at my career trajectory, my reports have gotten shorter. Maybe the complexity of my files has gone up too. I think there's a tendency maybe earlier on in your career to overquote and over-reference things so you don't miss anything. I think it's important to get the key policy issues, and I like the issue-based approach. I like to do that with when I'm summarizing the public input. We do tend to do that as a summary. We won't include, you know, hundreds or dozens of pages of comments. They're available in the file, but we haven't moved to that sort of thing. But some municipalities have absolutely everything in their files. So I would also say edit your work. You know, I think I don't want to generalize, but I've noticed that maybe some people that I'm mentoring now don't know when to use capital letters properly. I hate to say it, but that's a trend that I've been seeing. So at the very least, be consistent. If you're going to capitalize something, do it throughout your report. But it'll undermine your credibility if you have mistakes. So especially early on in your career, have some friends look at it, people that aren't planners and people that are. Yeah, other than that, yeah, standing the test of time was also what I wanted to mention. Oh yeah, and then also your tone or perspective is important. So make sure you use language like proposed or, you know, draft. I'm even really careful about using the words will versus would. I do see planners use will, and I feel a little uncomfortable about that because it does give an impression that a decision's already been made, and I really don't want that to be the impression. So.
Those are fantastic comments. The whole notion, and I can't say it to students enough, is the whole notion of editing your work, right? And we all fall into traps of
Yeah.
you know, we've got email that's flowing by so quickly. And actually, to be honest, I actually myself try to read and double check because I find automatic things happen in email.
Yeah.
You know, how did that happen? But it's also the preciseness and clarity of words, and invariably we will all see situations in email and in reports where people come back and they interpret something altogether different than what we did. And then we look at it and say, oh, actually, I get it. I understand how they've interpreted it differently than what I have. So again, it speaks to the clarity of our writing and coming back to it. So fantastic points. I hope everyone has really made some great notes because I have here. A couple of parallel questions for both of you. And it's not a fair question on one hand, because I realize all issues are of different complexity. But what would be a typical length of a report? And probably best to say a severance report as an example, so that we've got a more defined issue. Any thoughts of what a typical length would be?
Well, we get in trouble if ours is more than 1 page.
Yeah.
A severance report, and I'm talking legal.
Yeah.
But I would say those would maximum be 2 pages, and that's kind of always the way it's been. We haven't had any major mishaps as a result of that. We do have a high volume of severances because we still allow rural severances in non-prime areas. So we do have a busy office around that. Minor variances, you know, now we need to you know, talk about the 4 tests, so that make it, you know, 3 or 4 pages. It depends, and then other reports maybe 10. Yeah.
Victor?
Those sound more or less the way that mine would go. My severance reports are a little longer. Now I've got a challenge to try and get myself down to 1 page. I find I do try to throw images into the report. I found it saved me a bit sometimes when I'm talking with applicants or members of the public at the meeting, if I can flip to that page of my report. So it's definitely not 4 pages of pure text, single spacing. It tends to be padded out a fair bit with, you know, images or tables.
Cool. And then in your office, Victor, if I came there and I'm working in my first year, is somebody else likely to be reviewing my reports, or are they going directly to council? What's sort of the office protocol around that? And the same question for you too, Sarah, but Victor?
Yeah, I think it depends in a way on the amount of experience people have when they start with us. Usually anyone starting in the office, I think there will be eyes on the first few reports that they do, and also the first kind of increasing complexity reports that they handle, like a major subdivision. I imagine that there'd be a senior planner looking at it the first couple of times.
Mhm, mhm.
I had been with the department as a student for a fairly long time, so I was pretty quickly, once I was hired as a planner, just sending them straight to council without eyes on. And I don't have eyes on most of my reports unless it's going to the director for approval. It's just going straight from me to council.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, I guess that would same. It would depend on the experience of the individual. We do mentor. If somebody's more of a junior level, they might not sign their own reports for a while or co-sign. We are pretty careful about reviewing work, especially for people that are coming in new to the county. We do have a lot of longstanding staff, but we've had some new hires, and we just want to make sure we're all kind of, consistent. And yeah, I'll give that support as much as I can, but we don't go through like a tiered level of review that some larger municipalities might have. Yeah, definitely. When I'm taking a report to planning committee, the planning director will read it, but and maybe I might have a chat beforehand, but very little oversight. It definitely, I would have things going to council, local councils, without necessarily anyone else having looked at it.
Good point. And it's interesting to draw the comparison, because I'm aware of in some regions, for example, where it's sort of a layer upon layer upon layer of approval before a report will see the light of day. Whereas my experience, and I see the two of you saying it as well, is you have all of these clients, which are the municipalities out there, and you have to be accessible and provide reports directly to them. So those are fantastic comments related to the reports and so on. And I would also say, if you are existing as a young planner starting in an office, senior people, what they don't want to be doing is correcting spelling and grammar.
Oh,
and
I know.
It comes back to your comment earlier about proofread, and make sure those reports are in great shape before you're passing them along.
Yeah.
So we have one final question, which is in some ways what we just talked about covers it nicely, but this is more specifically oriented towards students, and that is, are there any words of advice for students as they become report writers? And we probably don't need to restate the editing one, we've said that one well, but other comments that you would have. And I'm not sure who we started with last, so I think actually it was you, Victor. So why don't we start with Sarah on this one?
Yeah, so documentation, file documentation is so important. I'm a documenter. I do write things down a lot. Of course, I'm starting to do things more. But you're dealing with so many calls and so many different types of files. You're constantly being interrupted, and it's tough. You might think you're going to remember, and I used to remember more.
It happens.
It does, yeah. But you have to remember that you're not always going to be there, and anybody should be able to pick up your file and know exactly where it is, what the status is. So I just can't emphasize that enough. I call it a gift to my future self. If you can write down what's going on, who you've talked to internally, externally, it really helps for writing your report down the road too. So that's a big one for me. Another thing that I like to do is, when I have letters of objection or support, I map where those people live, because sometimes the committee will want to know, but also, sometimes people might live in another municipality altogether. Sometimes they might not live anywhere near the development application, or sometimes they're right there, and you might need to go out on site and actually see, is there a grade difference? Are there unique situations here that really need to be looked at more closely? So that's an important one. Consider what the impact of your development application will be if it proceeds. but also if it doesn't. So it's so easy to get caught up in the moment and in the excitement of an important development application, and you might write the best bylaw that you can, or the best official plan amendment, and then they flip the property, or or they move on, and sometimes that can have unintended outcomes that you just might not have considered. So I think that's something that I've maybe stubbed my toe on. And for someone like myself, I've been working in planning for 25 years or so, and I'm still collecting report examples from other places. I'm always trying to make my reports better. I think we all need to be doing that, and because communication is such a big part of what we do. I also review OMB decisions, or sorry, LPAT decisions, because I find that some of them are very well written. Having a tribunal member writing something, sometimes it can just turn it on its side a little bit. And I've learned so much by reading some of those good board decisions. But my last piece of advice is around changing your report or your report recommendations. Particularly early in your career, when you're having people providing input into your writing, you might be asked to make changes to your report, or you might feel some pressure to change your recommendation. My planning director would always couch it by saying, now, as long as you agree, this is a suggestion that I have for you, or perhaps you might not be able to sign your report if somebody higher up wants it to go in a different direction. So you have responsibilities as well as a professional planner around that, and around your own protecting your practice, and staying true to what you think is right. So that's a pretty difficult thing to deal with in any office. So I just pass that on.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment on the professional obligations that we hold. I with some humor, I smiled your first comment around file documentation. You'd be interested in this. One of my first files I dealt with back when was a development on the perimeter of a golf course south of Exeter, actually. And so I went out, and the question was, what would be the impact of the golf course on neighboring farms? So I went out and interviewed a whole bunch of farmers. We get to the board hearing that was following this. So they subpoenaed my notes, and I actually, out of curiosity, back then I did the same thing I did today and do now, which is I have a scribble pad, right? And I don't know if you can see, it looked no better back then than it does now. So they subpoenaed my notes with all my terrible scribbles in it. I'm sure they couldn't do anything with them. They meant something to me, but not to them. But it was about documenting what I had done and the conclusions I had reached, and was able to, there was a paper trail, if you like, which is, I think, really important. So thanks for taking me back to that time and space.
Yeah.
Victor.
I think that basically covered everything that I kind of had jotted down. I guess the thing, thinking back when I was first starting to write reports, kind of transitioning from school into the professional work, it's really about looking at how other planners are writing their reports. Don't make up a new format just for the fun of it. Don't make up a new way to do it just for the sake of it. If there's a really good reason to improve something and make a tweak, then it might be worthwhile. But the formatting, the structure of it, there's kind of this inherited knowledge of this is why we do it. We've tweaked it. It works pretty well. And to focus in on the content, and then the other thing, as much as I said earlier about Rob stealing and duplicating, you have to be really intentional with it. Make sure you're not stealing something that was either, maybe it's a watered down version of the policy that it's the political negotiation, and it wasn't actually what the planner thought the best approach was. Maybe it's totally inappropriate for the situation you're in. So just be careful about it. It's a really good tool, but it can be easy to say, I'm looking for an Airbnb policy, find your first Airbnb policy, grab it, throw it in a report, and not have thought about all of the implications of that and the differences between where you're practicing as a professional and where that policy came from.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm reflecting this week, sort of approaching the end of semester, doing it as we are. We'll be talking also about subdivisions in that context. And I can remember writing subdivision reports, right, and all of the draft conditions, and how as easy it is to take those draft conditions from one and pluck it into another. You have to be really careful to make sure that the wording still works, that it still fits, and those conditions as you're using them are appropriate in the context in which you're applying. So I think we're just about to wrap up here. I'm going to offer thanks in just a second, but any final comments either of you would like to make based on our discussion or anything else that has occurred to you? Victor, anything else?
I don't think so. I guess the only thing would be on the point about accessibility. I have a stub my toe story. So I had written a report and I hadn't realized how much I relied on images and being able to describe things visually. And then the first time that I presented a development application to a council that included a person with a visual impairment, I was completely unprepared. I was a fish out of water. It was worse than being back to just starting school. Like I didn't have tools to deal with it. So try to think about those things. Think about how someone who has, you know, different abilities, different level of abilities will be dealing with your reports, because it's not that I have a great solution, but I definitely have found out what happens when you're not ready for it.
That's a great stub your toe story. Thank you for that. Sarah, anything final?
Yeah. I guess what I would say, as planners, we lift each other up, and I can tell you that there's a county planning directors forum, and we've been emailing each other with examples of delegation bylaws right now because of COVID-19. We also have a long-range planners group in Ontario that meets regularly, development directors of Ontario, regional planning directors. So we're always trading best practices and great ideas on emerging issues. So we do help each other a lot, and you're never alone in the planning field. So
that's a great summary comment. Thank you for that. So just in summary, I want to thank both of you. I think the insight has been fantastic. I'm hoping that people will take good notes, because if they're going to interviews this spring, as many are, this is great insight from that perspective, but also great insight to take into professional practice as they move forward. So thank you both, and I wish you all the best in the weeks and times to come. I know it's challenging times, but with good people, municipalities and society will cope as well. So thank you so much. Take care, and I'm going to hit the record button to stop recording, and then we can just do a final wrap up here.